So I just got my very first iPad about 1 week ago, and I think it's totally gonna change my surface pattern design workflow. As you can probably tell from looking around here, I'm typically a traditional artist, even when it comes to surface pattern design. So often my pattern making workflow will include getting out my paints and papers, painting something with watercolor or gouache, scanning it, bringing it into Photoshop, cleaning it up, removing the background, cutting out all the pieces, and then arranging the pattern in Photoshop. I've just always been really drawn to the very painterly, handmade kind of feel. And of course, it just seems like the best way to achieve that look is by actually hand painting my work with paints. As much as I love these hand painted patterns that I'm creating using this workflow I've been using so far, I've come to terms with the fact that it's a very time consuming way of doing this. From the time I paint the original artwork to actually building that pattern in Photoshop, it can take upwards of like 2 or 3 hours per pattern. And that really adds up. And on top of that, there's also no guarantee that I'm actually gonna like the pattern at the end of that 2 or 3 hours. And it's often the case that I go through this whole process, and by the time I actually build the pattern, I'm like, this one doesn't really work. I really need to go back to the drawing board and repaint these motifs, try again, and see what happens from there. And that's all well and good, and I think that's part of the learning process, but I also knew that there have got to be ways that I can add maybe some shortcuts or speed up my workflow a little bit, or just make my workflow a little bit more efficient. So I recently started entertaining the idea of potentially getting an iPad. Of course, I follow so many artists on Instagram and here on YouTube who use the iPad as a really integral part of their art making workflow. And so I've been curious about it for a really long time. And I think one of the main things that really drew me towards getting an iPad was that for whatever reason, it seems like it would be a much more natural feeling to create on a surface where I could see the artwork happening right underneath my pen than what I was doing on my kind of low-end drawing tablet. And I know that there are drawing tablets that allow you to do this too, but of course the idea of the portability of the iPad and just the power and other functions that it has really made this an enticing option for me. And on top of that, I also follow a good number of artists who are able to achieve a really realistic looking watercolor or gouache effect using their iPad and using Procreate. And anytime I see something like that, I'm like, okay, this could be something for me. So I recently decided to just bite the bullet and go for it, and here we are with my new iPad. Now, it's truly only been about a week since I received this in the mail, so I'm obviously very new to this, and like the title of this video suggests, these are just my very first impressions. I am not claiming to know everything there is to know about using an iPad for surface pattern design. I just kind of want to chat about how I think having this is going to change my workflow, especially while everything is fresh and new in my mind. So this is the most recent, the 2022 M2 chip iPad. It's 12.9 inches, and this one has 1 terabyte of memory, which is awesome. Now, I don't know if you're looking for these kinds of pro tips, but I actually ended up buying this iPad on a website called Swappa. I've used this website before. It's basically a tech resale website, but it's very trustworthy. They have a lot of good systems up to make sure the product that you're getting is quality. And there are a lot of reasons why I prefer to buy used anyway. I mean, of course, on one hand, you're saving money, and then also it seems less wasteful to me. Like when there's all these used products out there, why do I necessarily need to go buy a new one? So anyway, I was able to find this one on Swappa, and it was awesome because this guy said he basically bought it a year ago, used it like twice, and then put it in a drawer and never used it again. So it was basically like buying a new product anyway. And it came with this case on the iPad, and it came with the Apple Pencil as well. And when it was all said and done with the iPad and the case and the pencil and the extras, I definitely ended up saving a few $100s from what it would be if I were to have actually bought this new. So win-win-win across the board. I know it's going to be impossible to see on here, but I also bought a screen protector. You might be able to see it's a little bit more matte than shiny, but I bought one of those screen protectors that makes it feel like you're writing on paper instead of writing on glass. So I can leave the details for all of this in the description if you're interested. Okay, Okay, so let's move on to some of my very first impressions from when I first opened this out of the box. So the first thing I thought when I saw this iPad was that it's very large. Like, I knew I was getting the biggest size. I knew I was getting the 12.9 inch. And honestly, I've even seen this one in Costco when I go to Costco and I play with all the iPads that are out there. I've seen it before and I knew it was big, but when I opened it up, I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, I mean, if you think about it, this is larger than some laptop sizes, right? Some laptops are like 11-inch screens and this is 12.9 inch, so it's very large. For me, this is a pro of this iPad, and this is one of the reasons that I decided to get this one, because I know that I'm going to be using it for drawing and for creating patterns, and so having this large surface that I can use to create is going to be really powerful and really helpful for me. But that said, I also can totally understand why some people go for the smaller models, because those are very portable, can easily be thrown in like a little bag, no problem. This one will take, I guess, a little bit more planning, but to me it still seems very portable. Like, it doesn't seem like it would be very difficult to bring this around most places. And like I said, I think the large screen size will kind of win out and be a really big pro for me. In the week that I've had this, I haven't really had the chance to test that portability out and like take it too far out beyond my apartment, but even just within my apartment, I found that it's really easy to just move around. Like, I can use it while I'm painting, I can prop it up somewhere while I'm making dinner and have like a video on, I can use it on the couch, I can use it while I'm in bed. So in that respect, it definitely seems even more portable than like something like my laptop, for example. Okay, one other first impression is that I really love the way that the Apple Pencil feels. It has a really nice weight to it. Like, I don't really know what I'm talking about, but it's kind of, what would you call this? Top heavy, I guess? Like, to me, it feels like it's a little bit heavier at this end than on this end. And this is how I like to write with like an actual pen. This mimics that quite well. It also has this flat edge that is great. I mean, that's where the magnet works. And it also feels good to hold this, and you can like double tap it to switch between eraser and the brush in Procreate, which is super cool. Also, not only is this magnet thing very practical, but it's also so satisfying. Like, I love it. Procreate was the very first app that I downloaded when I got my iPad. Of course, this was like the main reason for me getting it, was to create artwork using my iPad and use it to create patterns. And I know that Procreate is one of the main ways that a lot of artists do that. So I wanted to start there. One of my very first impressions of Procreate when I first downloaded it was that it's kind of crazy that it costs like $12 or $13 one time and that's it. Like, I pay for an Adobe subscription so I can use Photoshop and a bunch of other programs as well. And obviously that's a lot more expensive than like spending $12 one time. So in the like week or so while I was waiting for the iPad to arrive to me, I watched a couple of Procreate classes on Skillshare to kind of orient myself to the interface and know a little bit about what's going on before I actually dove into it. And I'm really glad that I did that, because when I opened up Procreate for the very first time, I didn't feel completely lost. So that was really helpful. My other big impression of Procreate was I was super excited that it has so many of the powerful tools that I use in Photoshop really regularly for surface pattern design. And also, like, Photoshop is filled with a ton of amazing tools, but many of them I don't use at all for my surface pattern design work. And so I'm pretty excited that Procreate is like pretty focused on the tools that are most important for my surface pattern design workflow. Okay, so now I want to walk you through some of my very first drawings in Procreate. I'll show you what those looked like, kind of my thought process behind those. It's chaos, but let's do it. Okay, so welcome to my Procreate. You'll have to excuse the lighting. I haven't quite figured out the best way to film on an iPad, but here we go. So I want to walk you through some of the first artwork that I made in Procreate. So we'll start there and then we'll get into the patterns. So starting with my very first one here, this is a thing of beauty, truly. Jokes aside, this is just a picture that I took of my cats so that I could test out using different brushes and switching around with different colors and testing the pressure sensitivity a little bit and just seeing like what kind of textures that I could get with whatever brush I was using and getting a feel for just handwriting and stuff. So obviously this is not like an amazing work of art, but it was really helpful for me to be able to just dip my toes in a little bit and start to figure out how Procreate works. And then right after I did that one, you can see I called these files Playing with Procreate and Playing More. So these are just things that I did to mess around. And I was following along with Kat Cocolette's Intro to Procreate class on her Skillshare. For this one, I just basically traced a Monstera. This again was just to get familiar with like the different brushes, the different colors, different textures. You can see if I zoom in here, it's a nice textured brush that I used on this. Also played a little bit with blending modes on this one and like opacity and stuff like that. So again, not the most beautiful work of artwork in the whole wide world, but was super helpful for helping me learn the ropes a little bit and just become a little bit more comfortable using Procreate. After that, then you'll see that I moved into a whole bunch of watercolor type artwork. So this one right here is not mine. This is from the watercolor brush pack that I bought. So let me open that up so I can show you. I will link this specific brush pack below. Here's like a preview of the different brushes that come in this pack. So very natural looking watercolor, and so I was excited about that. But this is just kind of what the setup comes with. And so this is like an example artwork. It's really cool to see actually the look that he's able to achieve using these brushes and this watercolor paper background. I don't know how well you'll be able to see on screen, but this is a nice textured watercolor paper, which when I'm working in Photoshop, I love to use this kind of thing. So I was excited to play with it in Procreate. Here's the very first thing that I made using the watercolor brushes and watercolor paper texture. Again, it's no masterpiece, but it was so much fun to play with these watercolor brushes and figure out how they blend together a little bit, and like when I like to blend them or like to keep them kind of unblended, figuring out how to use things like splatters and just seeing how different colors look when I blend them together. So yeah, I'm treating this basically like a sketchbook and not taking it too seriously at this stage and just kind of having fun playing. One thing I loved about this is that this came together really, really quickly. Like I kind of mentioned before, I didn't need to get out all of my paints and my paper and my water and like get all set up. This can come together so quickly, although I can see how the undo function is like a benefit and a curse, because when I'm painting traditionally, you kind of have to commit to it, especially with something like watercolor, or if you make a mistake, you have to figure out how to make it work. Whereas in Procreate, you've got an undo button, so you can redo something however many times you want until you're happy with it. So I think there's pros and cons to that. Anyway, moving on to the next thing. I have a couple of documents here where I played a little more specifically with painting watercolor florals. So I actually started by creating a color palette here. This is just a photo that I grabbed from Pinterest because I really liked the color scheme, but this was a helpful way for me to learn how to like use the color picker and define my own color palette over here in the palette section. So that was a great learning experience here. And then I took this palette that I created and I turned it into a little watercolor floral sketch here. So this is me trying to figure out how to replicate what I know my brushes in real life can do on Procreate. And so it's still a lot to figure out, but some things that I love from this, for example, would be like, look how cool I think it looks when this orange and red kind of blend together. I think that this replicates what watercolor behaves like in real life pretty well. So I was really, really excited about that. I think something that's interesting with painting in Procreate is that you don't necessarily have to follow all of the actual watercolor rules that you would follow when you're painting traditionally. Like, for example, some of the lighter colors that I use in some of these flowers, if I was actually painting with watercolor in real life, you would just have to think proactively about that and leave those white spaces or those lighter spaces on your paper. Whereas in Procreate, you can just choose a lighter color and paint that lighter color on top of your painting. So it's an interesting and different way of thinking, but it's fun to figure out. Okay, so those were my first like random sketches and drawings and stuff just to like get a feel for Procreate a little bit. And then I jumped into making a couple of patterns. So I want to talk about my very first patterns in Procreate. They are messy, they are not perfect, but I'm so excited about the ability to make these on my iPad. So to get started with these patterns, I started by taking a Skillshare course by Mel Armstrong. I've talked about her before. I will talk about her again. Her Skillshare classes are, they are chef's kiss, top tier. I really love them. And it was a super helpful class about how to set up your repeating pattern in Procreate. So let's move on now to the pattern work that I've done in Procreate so far. So I'll admit it's not a ton yet. Like I said, I've only had this for about a week, so still a lot to figure out, but we'll start with my very first pattern here. So I followed a tutorial from Mel Armstrong on Skillshare. She used a method in Procreate where you use basically a diamond repeat, and it kind of works like a half drop repeat. And so I don't know if you can tell right here, but everything is set up in a diamond, and I can show you a little bit better if I take away the corners, for example. So this whole tile is kind of set up in this way. And so the way that I did this one is this, what we're seeing right here, this is kind of my sketch. And so this is really just scribbles that I drew on using this like colored pencil, which by the way, it totally blew my mind that when I was using the tip of my pencil, it was just like using the tip of a colored pencil, and then when I kind of used the edge of the Apple pencil, it shaded like an actual colored pencil. Like maybe that's silly to be like mind blown about that, but truly I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I had no idea the Apple pencil did that, so that was really cool. But anyway, I used this as my sketch to figure out how to lay out my repeating tile, and this to me is one of the things that I was most excited about with using Procreate versus the other method I've been using for creating my patterns, because in my mind this is a really great way to be able to fiddle with the layout quite a bit more and just like mess around and figure out how you want your pattern to flow before you even get into painting your motifs. And so that's kind of the opposite of how I have been doing things, where like I paint the motifs first and then I just hope that they'll fit together and that I'll be able to figure out somehow. So the ability to be able to do it kind of in the flip-flopped order, I think will be really awesome. So anyway, this is the sketch version of my pattern. And then what I did is I brought this tile into a new file in Procreate, and I used my watercolor brushes to paint over my sketch and get a more final look on a lot of these flowers. So that was a really interesting and fun process. And again, I'm trying to figure out what looks I like. So, you know, sometimes I blend the colors quite a bit. Sometimes I leave them looking very distinct and unblended, I guess. And so this is really just a big kind of playground, like sandbox to figure out what I like, what I don't like. You know, what I'll say right off the bat for this pattern is like the yellow flowers, I really do like those, and the little blue ones and kind of all the little flowers. But the big blue ones and the big red ones are a little bit too like in your face for me. So this was a great learning experience to figure out some of the things I do like and some of the things I might do a little bit differently. Something that's super fun with Procreate is all of these little filler flowers are so fast to do, and it's so cool that I can do so many unique ones so quickly, because oftentimes when I'm doing fillers like this, when I'm working in Photoshop, what I'll end up doing is like when I painted things traditionally, I have maybe like 5 filler flowers or something like that to work with, and it seems like a lot at the time, but then when I get into Photoshop, it's just a bunch of copying the same one and moving it around and flipping it and trying to skew it in a way that it looks a little bit different, but ultimately it's like the same filler over and over again. Whereas when I'm working this way in Procreate, it takes me like 2 seconds to just draw another quick little filler one, and it is totally different and unique. So I loved that about working in here. Okay, so moving on to the most recent patterns that I made. So I worked on a couple patterns here to match with a pattern I made a while back, I think it was last spring or last summer, of betta fish. It's a really colorful, fun watercolor type pattern, and I wanted to make some coordinating prints to go with it. So my very favorite one, and the first one that I did, is just this random blobs using one of the built-in default acrylic brushes in Procreate because I wanted to maintain this painterly texture, as you can hopefully see on all of these blobs, but I also wanted to pull it together pretty quickly, and I was totally able to achieve that. And once again, using the same technique that I used with the wildflowers, I was able to create a color palette from my original beta fish pattern. So that's what this one is right here. And then I just used those colors with the acrylic brush to build this pattern. And I used a slightly different technique than the diamond repeat that I used with those florals we were just looking at. For this one, I used a technique that's more similar to how I do things in Photoshop. So that was fun to figure out, but I really like the way that this one ended up looking. Honestly, this is my favorite Procreate pattern that I've made so far, and from start to finish, it took me like 15 minutes. So this could open doors for me. I'm really super psyched about this. And then finally, I took that same color palette and I just wanted to play with different pattern types. Listen, I don't love this one to the moon and back necessarily. Again, it was just a great learning experience. I took like a dry brush in Procreate and then that same color palette and just layered them on a bunch in that diamond repeat and created this one as like some kind of blender. It kind of gives old-fashioned wallpaper, and I don't know if it's in a way that I like or not, but anyway, it was a great learning experience to figure out how to do this. And again, it came together in probably like 10-15 minutes, so that's super exciting. Okay, so those are my very first impressions of my iPad and of Procreate. And in addition to everything I've already talked about in this video, I've identified a few other ways that I think having this iPad is going to improve my surface pattern design and more broadly my like Pepo Studios workflow. Number one is that this is really great for having my reference photos up while I'm painting. That's something that I did actually in my very last video on YouTube. You can check that out if you haven't seen it yet, but I was painting some little acryl gouache sketches of Ireland and I had my photos up in Procreate. And I don't know if this is a pro tip or like it low-key feels kind of like cheating, but I don't know, this is what I do. Like if I am mixing colors with my paint, sometimes what I'll do is I'll do the like little color selector in Procreate. If I'm having a hard time visualizing that color, if I'm able to isolate it with a color picker, it gives me a much better idea of how to mix that color. So I've really loved using my iPad for that purpose. And I kind of mentioned this before, but obviously an iPad is basically like a super portable computer. So in addition to all of my art stuff, I'm also definitely going to be able to use this for all kinds of other Pepo Studios work. Like for example, my notes for this video that you're watching right now, I just took notes on Notion on my iPad and it was awesome. I really enjoyed it. So that was really great. And I know there are all kinds of other things like that that I'll be able to do on my iPad. Another thing for me is that pretty soon I am moving to a situation where I'm gonna have to commute to my day job using a train. And so it'll be a pretty long train ride. I'll have a decent amount of time, probably at least 45-50 minutes sitting on the train, that I'll be able to use my iPad. And I'm really excited about that because sometimes it's a little difficult to incorporate art into my work days. And so on the days that I commute on the train, that'll be like a built-in time that I'll be sitting there. I have nothing else to do, no other responsibilities, and I can just like sit there and draw on my iPad. I'm so excited about that. And also one last thing I'll say is that when I got my iPad, I was a little nervous that it was gonna mean that I was just gonna like stop doing traditional artwork. And that's actually something that someone who commented on one of my videos recently mentioned, that like, just FYI, you might just like totally stop actually painting once you get your iPad. I was like a little bit nervous about that, and I'm happy to report that it hasn't actually stopped me from doing my physical traditional painting as well. Like I really feel happy having this best of both worlds. I can do both things at any time and it's been really great. So that's what I'm hoping to continue going forward, is incorporate a little bit of both and stay with my patterns more generally. Like just because I have this iPad doesn't mean that all of my patterns I'm gonna make on my iPad from here on out. I think there's plenty that I'll still use the method I was already using by painting and bringing them into Photoshop and whatnot. So I'm just happy to have additional options and I'm really excited to see where it takes me. So I am really super excited to have this new resource to play with. I know that there are a ton of other resources and like a gazillion other tips and tricks that other surface pattern designers have for using their iPad in their surface pattern design workflow. workflow. And since I'm so new to this whole iPad surface pattern design world, I would love if you could share with me any of your favorite resources or your best tips or tricks for incorporating an iPad into your surface pattern design workflow. Like I said, I follow a ton of really great artists on Instagram who use them, and so I'm often like saving these videos like, oh, I have to try this and I have to try this. But if there are any of you who do this really regularly yourself, let me know. Let me in on your very best secrets. I would really appreciate it, and I'm sure other people watching this video could also learn from each other as well. So I'm really excited to see what you have to say and to keep playing with this fun new tool. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you like this video and if you think I've earned it, would you please give me a little like and maybe even a subscribe if you're feeling generous? Also, if you're curious to see more about my Photoshop surface pattern design workflow, I have a whole tutorial series. It's basically like a free course here on my YouTube channel. So I will put a link to the very first lesson in that series here. Feel free to check it out. And with that, thank you very much for being here, and I will see you very soon for my next video. Take care, everyone.